The air grew thick with the scent of sulfur and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Danny Jay Balch and his 5 friends huddled together in their campsite, staring up at the mountain that towered over them. Looming ominously in the distance, its peak obscured by a thick cloud of ash and smoke. Danny and his friends had set up camp at the foot of Mount St. Helens for a weekend camping trip, something they had done many times before. This time was different. A deafening rumble grew. What followed was a terrifying ordeal as Danny and his friends fought for survival against the full force of Mother Nature. They watched in horror as the mountain unleashed a deadly avalanche of ash and debris, tearing through the landscape with a ferocity that defied belief. Mount St. Helens, the sleeping giant, had awoken from its slumber, and Danny knew that disaster had struck. Danny had been looking forward to a beach trip with his friends for weeks, but last-minute peer pressure led to a change of plans. The beach changed to a forest, and Danny agreed to go along. They loaded up their gear and set off towards the mountains, eager for adventure and the chance to escape the city. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, the trees grew taller and the air grew cooler. The winding roads gave way to dirt tracks, and the chatter of the radio was replaced by the sound of nature all around them. Eventually, they found a spot to set up camp, a clearing surrounded by towering pines and with a breathtaking view of the mountain. They quickly unloaded their gear and set about building a fire, ready to cook up a feast of hot dogs and s'mores. As the sun began to set, they sat around the fire telling ghost stories and laughing at each other's jokes. For a moment, everything felt perfect, like they were the only people in the world, a sense of peace which wouldn't last long. The group went to bed around 3 a.m. At 8:32 the next morning, Danny and his friends were sound asleep in their tents. Suddenly they were awoken by a loud rumbling noise. As they rushed out of their tents, they could see that Mount St. Helens was already beginning to erupt. Ash and smoke completely enveloped the mountain, and the smell of sulfur filled the air. Danny and his friends ran towards the trees, hoping for some shelter from the erupting volcano. As they ran, the air turned black with ash, and they lost all visibility. Suddenly, a first blast hit them, and they were showered with ash, mud, and ice. Danny was knocked to the ground and covered in mud, frozen. Then, immediately after, he was hit with a second blast. This time, it was an inferno. He went from freezing cold to scalding in an instant. As he struggled to get up, Danny realized he couldn't find his friends. He called out for them, but the noise of the eruption made it difficult to hear anything. Despite the danger, he decided to search for them. Danny crawled through the ash and debris, his hands and legs burning from the heat. He stumbled over downed trees and through rivers of warm, muddy water, slightly soothing his burns. Just as he was about to give up, he felt a hand grab him. It was one of his friends, Brian, badly injured and trapped under a tangle of fallen trees. Danny reached down to pull Brian out and noticed the blackened skin peeling off his own hand from the burns. But he got his friend out. Brian had suffered a shattered hip and couldn't walk. Then the ash really rained down. It blanketed everything. Danny was a 26-year-old man born and raised in the Lewis River Valley in Washington state. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, he had a love for the outdoors and often went hiking and camping with his friends. His parents also lived nearby, and although Danny was close with them, he hadn't told them of his change of beach plans, although they knew him for his adventurous spirit and his ability to stay calm in difficult situations. Danny and Brian huddled together for nearly 2 hours, struggling to breathe and using their shirts as filters against the ash-filled air. As they waited in the darkness, they suddenly noticed 2 of their other friends appearing through the thick smoke. As they approached, Danny felt some relief. The four of them knew they had to get to safety, but they were unsure of how to do so, and two others were still missing. As they stumbled through the darkness carrying Brian, they finally came across what remained of an old cabin. It wasn't much, but it provided some shelter from the ash and heat. They made the decision to leave Brian there while they went out for help. Mount St. Helens, located in the Cascade Range in Washington state, is a volcano that had been dormant for over a century before it suddenly erupted on May 18, 1980. The mountain was named after the British diplomat Lord St. Helens in 1792. Prior to the eruption, the mountain had a beautiful cone shape and was a popular destination for hikers and skiers. However, the violent eruption caused widespread destruction and forever changed the landscape of the surrounding area. They left the cabin and Brian behind. Danny had no shoes on, and the scalding ash was nearly 2 feet deep in places, making it almost impossible to walk without burning his feet. He tried to avoid the ash by jumping on downed trees, but it was a slow and painful journey. Eventually, they decided to split up. Danny finally stumbled upon a river and waded through it as much as possible to avoid the ash, but the water was also hot and filled with debris. He walked for nearly 11 miles, exhausted and in pain, before he finally came across another family. He waited with the family, who had a few supplies to share. He borrowed some extra shoes and snacked on some licorice until finally, a rescue helicopter spotted them at 6 p.m. Danny told the rescuers where to find Brian, who was still stranded in the cabin. He told them that his 2 other friends had split off and were still out there. The rescue team was in disbelief they had survived, and eventually found all 3 of them. They airlifted him to the hospital immediately, and as soon as he had given them all the information he had, he lost consciousness. Danny didn't regain consciousness in the hospital until the following Sunday, and he was devastated to learn that his 2 missing friends, Terry and Kevin, had been crushed by a falling tree in the blast. They never made it out of their tent. But he was relieved to hear that everyone else was recovering from their injuries. Danny himself eventually made a full recovery, albeit with minor lung damage from the smoke to this day. In the end, the Mount St. Helens disaster was one of the deadliest volcanic eruptions in U.S. history, claiming the lives of 57 people. Danny Balch and his friends were some of the lucky ones who survived, but they would never forget the horror they experienced on that fateful day the mountain exploded.